Show me your anger, and I'll show you your fear. At the root of the most difficult relationships we have in our life really is fear. And without a proper understanding of our own personal fears and how they get triggered in our relationships, we're going to experience a lot of suffering and relational difficulties. Now, to be certain, in our relationships, there's certain things that people may do that, irrespective of us operating in agape love, it's going to happen, meaning that we are seeking to live with peace with them, but they don't want peace. And we need to understand that that will happen in our relationships. And for those situations, what we can do is continue to love as long as it's not an abusive situation, loving according to 1 Corinthians 13. But for those situations that are really not abusive relationships, or really in general, most relationships are really going to follow what I'm saying. That according to the word of God, that most of our relational problems are really based on the fact that we have fears. There are desires of, as I've mentioned before, I will link that video in regards to when I talk about desires and just us being really upset because of the fact that our desires are not being met. Listen, that is the root of why we fear, because we have desires that are not being met and we get upset about it. So the real reason why we're upset really is not the real reason. It's really about our fears. And so without understanding our fears, as I mentioned, there's huge consequences. A lot of times we're in relationships and we just see it's the other person, it's the other person, it's the other person. If we could just change the other person. Whereas God is looking at us to say, what is going on within us? What are the fears that we have? What are the desires, unmet desires that we have that are causing relational conflict? And He wants us to take a look at ourselves in order to begin to start to move that relationship in a better direction, right? And listen, you may be wondering today, what kind of fears am I talking about? I want to mention to you some fears that are taken from The DNA of Relationships by Dr. Gary Smalley. And in this book, Dr. Smalley, he mentions some core fears. Let me mention to you several of them. And I'm going to actually take my other book here out before I talk about some of the work there in Dr. Smalley's work. So here's some core fears. We feel, or we fear, feeling a sense of helplessness and powerlessness. We fear that. And so if we fear being out of control, meaning that we can't control a situation and something happens and we feel like that person or that situation can go in a direction that we don't want it to go, that fear can lead into conflict and relational difficulties. So imagine having someone in your life where you feel maybe they're a bit irresponsible, you feel like they make decisions all the time that really jeopardize maybe yourself or other people who are close to you. You may get in a lot of relational conflicts with that person around that area because you fear what? Not being able to control the outcome. You fear something bad happening as a result of that person's decisions or what they fail to do. So therefore, as a result of that, that fear, once again, is what really is triggering a relational disagreement between you and someone else or other folks. Number two, here's another example. Maybe you fear being rejected. And because you fear being rejected, if you get into a conflict with someone, that fear is lying down below the surface. So something happens and maybe they said something to you about yourself and you're thinking to yourself that that feels like you are rejecting me. You're not saying that, or you may say it to the person, but it's deep down a fear. You don't want to feel rejected. So just a comment, maybe they make a comment that your hair doesn't look great today. Whatever it may be, and you have a fear that they're saying that you don't belong in the group that you are right now because your hair doesn't look good, then perhaps at that moment, that's when anger is going to start taking place and a relational conflict with that person may take place. There are other fears, like fears of abandonment, fears of being disconnected from others or being alone, fear of being a failure, fear of being unloved as if no one could love you. You could have a fear of being defective, as if something is wrong with you. These are all fears that we can have. Fear of feeling hypocritical or phony, fear of being cheated or ripped off. On and on it goes. Somali has itemized those fears, really the basic fears that we typically have that show up in our relationships in his book there, The DNA of Relationships. And so he gives actually a wonderful example, a story in his book of how these issues can come to bear. And if you have listened to my prior video, again, I can link that for you to see the video. I talk about the fact that the Word of God is very clear about this. I'm talking about the DNA of relationships and some of the research that Dr. Somali came into. But the reality is that the Word of God has already spoken about this. In James 4, verses 1-3, the Word of God says that really the root cause of our issues, the root cause of every fight, every disagreement is pride, is our desires, is our fears. It's about us. And so we see the problem always outside of us. And I'm not saying that there's not a problem, real problem outside of us. But the true root cause is really most of the times within us. And that's why we're dealing with some of the relational issues that we are. Once again, we're not talking about abuse here. And so Gary gives the story of his and some relatives, and they got into a fight one night as a husband and a wife. And the husband, because he had a day off, he decided that he was going to rearrange their bedroom and to kind of make it nice, okay, for his wife. He thought she would just love it. So he went ahead and rearranged the bedroom while she was at work. She came home, and it was later that night. The room was dark. She obviously couldn't see much. She was trying not to wake him up. She started tripping over different things in the room. Things were falling. All sorts of things were happening. So the lights get turned on, and then she sees that the room was rearranged. But she went off. She got upset. And because she got upset, then now her husband is upset, and it started what we call is the fear dance. We'll talk a little bit about that more in our next video. And let me say this. The primary fear that she had that caused this relational conflict is that, listen, they pushed each other's fear buttons. She pushed Greg's fear of failure button, and Greg, her husband, pushed Erin's fear of invalidation button. That was all that was needed for them to get into a place where they were fighting all night, or a good portion of the night, in regards to the fact that one felt this way based on someone's action. So it no longer became about the fact that the room was rearranged. It was the fact that you made me feel a sense of invalidation, and someone feeling a sense of failure, right? And that is really the root cause of why that arguments just really went out of control. So I want you to think about this as you think about your own relationships, particularly relationships that are difficult. One of the things that I want you to do right now is really to listen to these 3 tips that I'm going to share with you right now and do them. Number 1, I want you to identify what your fear is. When you get into relational difficulties, what are some of the fears that commonly come up? And particularly, I want you to think about a recent conflict that you've had with someone or disagreement. What was really at the root of it? What were you fearing? What was it that you really wanted to see happen? Going back to James 4, what was your desire that was not being met there? I can link in the description box as well the core fears that I've mentioned in this broadcast, in this video. All right, number 2, evaluate how you react in disagreements. All right, so how do you tend to react? I want you first, number 1, to identify the core fear. So that could be, I fear feeling insecure. I fear not being loved. I fear someone thinking that I am a failure, or fear me being a failure, right? So you first identify those core fears. The second thing that you're going to want to do is to evaluate how you react in disagreements. What happens when your fear buttons are pushed? Do you tend to get angry in terms of actual outbursts? Do you become more quiet and silent and kind of withdraw? Because that also is a form in where we could be angry, but we're just because we're not expressive or explosive doesn't mean that anger is not there. Or are we someone that just at the end of the day may just give a cold shoulder? We act as if we're indifferent, but we really, at the end of the day, are really upset. So, how do we tend to respond when we have disagreements with others? We need to capture that as well to see how we are interacting with those who are in our life. And number 3, I want you to own your part of the relational issue and commit to deal with those issues before God. Number 1 and 2 is critical to get to number 3. Because if we don't see in a particular relationship that we are a part of the problem, and therefore the good news is that we can also become a part of the solution. If we don't see that, then guess what? The hope of the relationship really changing gets diminished, because we have to be able to see that we are also both a part of the problem and a part of the solution. And that as we see both of those things, definitively, we have a real shot of seeing that relationship change for the better. Now, we'll talk more about the fear dance next week and what that looks like in a little bit more detail next week. And that is really kind of helping us to see how this really develops into fights and quarrels. Keep in mind, James 4:1-3. We'd love you to spend some time meditating and thinking and reflecting on that verse in light of the content that was shared today. I thank you so much for watching the video today and joining me. I'm going to link for you once again the video on love that I did prior to this so that you can kind of get the context of some of the things in which I've discussed today. In the meantime, I hope you've been inspired and you'll go forth and you will inspire others. See you soon.